Alright, in this video I'm going to be replacing the rear wheel bearings in my 2012 Nissan Pathfinder. I've already done the front ones. I'll put a price comparison between the DIY cost and the dealership cost, and I will put some links in the description, so if you want to see some tools I use, that sort of thing, you can go into the description. That's the wheel bearing right there, and I've already taken the brakes off the vehicle. One thing I'm going to point out is that you're supposed to replace these bolts. Now it says that in both the Haynes manual as well as the Nissan manual, and I've watched a few videos of this online and nobody's really replacing these bolts, so they are not to be reused apparently, and you can see the product number there. Anyway, I'll put it in the description as well, but I'm not sure if they're torque to yield bolts or if you're just not supposed to reuse them because they hold your wheel bearings in. But anyway, you should get those replaced. They're only about $6 each, but obviously you need 4, and these are Moog 541003 wheel bearings, and that's what they look like when they are brand new. Now my vehicle has 300,000 kilometers on it. I think these wheel bearings are going to outlast the rest of my vehicle, so I'm not too concerned about them not being as good as maybe the Nissan wheel bearings or something like that. So I've been hitting this with PB Blaster once I've got all of the brake components off. I have videos on the brakes already, so I'll put links in the description for those as well. So if you want to see how to remove the brake pads and rotors, you can see that, and it's got all the torque specs as well. Now I'm hitting these with PB Blaster from both the front and the back. They're actually pretty easy to get off because these bolts are only torqued down to 44 foot-pounds, so it's not like they're just wrenched on there crazy tight, and they're actually pretty accessible as well. Now when you're taking this thing apart, the first thing I would recommend doing is getting this cotter pin off. You also need to get a new cotter pin for both sides. Don't reuse the cotter pins. And in fact, the only thing that you can reuse is the axle nut. So the big 32 mil nut, you can reuse that one, but I do get new ones. My new policy on this vehicle is just go and get new hardware. Once the pin is out, I've put the vehicle into neutral, and then I'm going to slot a crowbar in between the wheel's lug nuts. I put the lug nuts back on. You don't really have to if you're just going to throw this thing out. It doesn't really matter if the threads get damaged, and that's going to prevent the wheel bearing from moving. And I've got a deep socket for this. If you have a shallow socket or just a normal size socket, it's not going to work. And I have an impact for this as well. It did make pretty short work of this. I'm sure a breaker bar would have done the trick as well. And like I said, the manuals I have do not say that you need to throw that nut out when you're done with it, but I do it anyway. They're actually not that expensive either. Now you do need to push the axle in a little bit. I found that a socket doesn't get to the bolts on the backside without first pushing in the axle. There's just some stuff in the way. So I did use my 3-jaw puller, and you can see right there where it kind of snakes around that chunk of metal. Anyway, part of the axle there was preventing me from getting my socket in there, but once I've pushed it back, it's not a problem. And that's a 17 mil socket, and then I just use a short extension. I do mix it up between using a breaker bar and then using just a regular ratchet to get these off. Sometimes they're a little tight, but really it's very easy. I didn't have any problems with this, and I have one of the rustiest Pathfinders on YouTube, I'm sure of it. And it is difficult to film these things, but I think that if you can see where to put PB Blaster on the front and you can visualize the bearing, you'll be able to find these no problem. And there's only 4 of them, so there's 4 each side. And like I said, I did get new bolts, and when I did the front, I did not get new bolts because I watched YouTube videos. And then obviously when I went and checked the torque spec and that sort of thing, that's where I learned that these bolts aren't supposed to be reused. So I did have to go back and put new bolts on. Once the 4 bolts holding everything on are off, I take a dead blow, and then I just smack the wheel bearing assembly for a little while, and then it just pops out. It's actually easier to remove than the ones in the front, and I also found that it wasn't very rusty for where the wheel bearing assembly mounts back up to the vehicle. So I just spray chlorinated brake cleaner in there and then use a wire brush and just get some of the chunks of rust out. But like I said, really it's not that bad. And after scrubbing with the wire brush, I just hit it up with some brake cleaner again and then let it dry out for about 1 minute. Once the brake cleaner's evaporated, I do use anti-seize. Again, probably not required. I don't think this vehicle is going to last that long, and I don't think I'm going to replace these bearings ever again. But in case I do, I'll throw a little bit of anti-seize in here as well. And then the new wheel bearing just slots in there. A little bit tricky because of the drum brakes, and that's one thing to be careful as well. Make sure that you don't smack the drum brakes or cause any of the springs to pop loose. And I'll show you where to look in a second just to make sure that you don't mess anything up. But I do put the axle nut on just so that the wheel bearing doesn't fall off, and then I do the screws on the back hand tight initially. I treat it very much like putting on a tire on the vehicle, so sort of a crisscross pattern. I don't take just one bolt and tighten it all the way down. So instead of going straight to 44 foot-pounds, I do it by hand first for all 4 bolts, and then take the ratchet and probably bring it to about 10 to 15 foot-pounds. And then once the bolts are semi-snugged up, I then take the torque wrench and then go 44 foot-pounds on each of those 4 bolts. And I did find that on each side, there's one bolt that's a little bit tough to get at with a torque wrench. And what I did was I used a secondary jack and then just lifted it up a little bit so I can get the torque wrench in there. And one thing to note, I do use a jack, and on the other side of the jack, can't really see it, are 2 axle stands that are holding up the vehicle. So don't just rely on a jack. And then obviously I lower the jack to lower the wheel back down and do the rest of the bolts. Again, 44 foot-pounds on everything for the bolts that are holding on the wheel bearing assembly. I then went back and put the vehicle back in neutral so that the rear wheel could spin, and then I'm going to put the crowbar slotted back in such a manner that I could torque the axle nut down to 177 foot-pounds, which is the torque spec on the rear that I have in both my Haynes manual as well as in the online Nissan manual. So 177 foot-pounds, which is actually quite a bit. And then once that's done, we'll drop the cotter pin back in. And I'll use needle nose pliers and the dead blow hammer to just bend the cotter pin around the axle. And that's obviously just there so that the axle nut can't back off all the way. And that's pretty much it. Like I said, I do have a brake video where I go over how to remove and install the brakes. But before I move on to the passenger side wheel bearing, I do take some anti-seize and I put it on the wheel bearing assembly. So again, I'm just going to look at all the components of the drum brakes and make sure that I didn't knock anything loose, especially these springs on the bottom. They're pretty small and could easily be overlooked. And as long as that's good to go, obviously I'm just going to put the disc brake back on, and that's it. Now on the other side of the vehicle, pretty much the identical thing. So I'm going to take that cotter pin out first, and thankfully I didn't break my needle nose pliers. This is not the best way to use them, but it's effective at getting this cotter pin out. Then with the vehicle in neutral, I put my crowbar into position to hold the wheel bearing from moving, and then I'll take the impact and the 32mm socket and remove the axle nut, and then same deal, I couldn't get those bolts out until I pushed the axle in. Once that was done, I could get at those 17mm bolts on the backside. And just like all the other ones, they really weren't too hard to take off. A little bit tight in certain areas. I did use the dead blow to loosen them every once in a while as well. But like I said, overall, they're really not that hard to remove. And there's all 4 of them. I did find that this wheel bearing assembly was a little bit difficult to remove. So what I did was take a 10-pound sledge and then like a brick chipper tool. And then I just got in there and used the sledge and that little chipper, and that did the trick no problem. A couple of taps and it was loosened off enough that I could just pull the wheel bearing assembly straight out. And then same deal as with the other side. It wasn't too rusty in there, so just a little bit of brake cleaner, a little bit of work with the wire brush, and then a little more brake cleaner, and that was all there was to it. Once that was done, I took some anti-seize once again and just put it on the surfaces that the wheel bearing assembly would come into contact with. And then I took the wheel bearing and obviously put it back in place. Then I took the 4 new bolts. Once again, I put them all in hand tight initially, and then take the socket wrench and tighten them to about 15-ish foot-pounds. And then finally, I'm going to take the torque wrench and then get in there and torque everything down to the proper 44 foot-pounds. Overall, for this job, I think it only takes about an hour a side. As long as everything goes well and you have the right tools, it's not that difficult to do. I think anyone could do it. It's really just not that difficult to do. There are a few bolts to take off, but that's about it. And like I said, 44 foot-pounds for all these bolts on the back is the torque specification I used. And just like on the other side, I did find that one of the bolts tended to be a little bit too low with the suspension totally unsprung like that. So I did have to take the jack on this side as well and just lift everything up so I can get under there. Anyway, I then put the vehicle back in neutral, put the crowbar back in place so that the wheel bearing wouldn't move, and then obviously took the axle nut, put that onto the vehicle, put it onto the vehicle hand tight, and then took the torque wrench and went to, once again, 177 foot-pounds. And the last thing you really got to do is take a new cotter pin, drop that in, and once again, needle nose pliers and a dead blow hammer to make sure the cotter pin is held in place properly. For the front of the vehicle, I did one side per day, but for the back of the vehicle, for these rear ones, I did both in one afternoon. And in my opinion, I found that the rear ones were just much easier to do than the fronts. The front one have speed sensors and that sort of stuff in them. These are sort of just dumb, plain old wheel bearings. Nothing to them. No technologies or anything like that are built into the system. And then once again, I'm going to check all of the braking components before I put the disc brakes back on the vehicle. I guess it's sort of a disc and drum brake combo. Anyway, there's the old ones. Thanks for checking out my video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.